The smell of disinfectant was the first thing that told me the truth, a truth my mother's heart refused to accept. It wasn't the smell of a place for temporary healing, but the sterile, permanent odor of being forgotten. 7 days ago, my son Ricardo and his wife Isabella brought me to this impersonal room in a public hospital in Mexico City, with its peeling walls and the constant echo of distant coughs and laments. "It's just for a few days, Mom, until you feel stronger," Ricardo said, avoiding my gaze, while Isabella was already adjusting the car mirror, impatient to leave. In that moment, I was just an obstacle on their path to a lighter life, a life without the weight of a mother bent by arthritis and time. They left me with a small, worn-out cloth bag, where I keep what's left of me, a sewing kit, some undergarments, and the fragile dignity they couldn't manage to tear away. Every night, the phantom hum of my old Singer machine fills the silence, a melody that reminds me of the small studio in my house, the home I sold to give them the down payment for the luxurious apartment where I was no longer welcome. Every stitch I made in my life, every wedding dress, every school uniform, every adjusted hem, was a brick in the construction of their future, a future where, ironically, there was no room for me. I had become an old scrap of fabric, stored in a box never to be used again. But tonight, as I watched the fragile young woman in the next bed shiver with cold, her tattered sweater offering little comfort, something changed. Her large, lost eyes met mine, and she asked me the question that reawakened the purpose in my gnarled, useless hands. And there, in the cutting silence of that place of abandonment, I didn't plan revenge. I planned my resurrection. If you love Jesus and believe this story will teach us something, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes of Healing and Wisdom Stories. Your subscription is an act of faith in your own transformation, and I ask you to join our community of souls who have been through something similar. The days in the hospital merged into a gray and painful routine, marked by the sharp sound of the medication cart at 6 in the morning, and the heavy silence that settled after the last moan of the night. My room's window faced a brick wall, a perfect metaphor for the end of the line I found myself at. I watched other families come and go, bringing flowers, magazines, and the warmth of trivial conversations that, to me, sounded like the most beautiful music. They brought containers of homemade food, and the smell of cumin and cilantro that escaped down the hallway transported me back to my kitchen, to the Sundays when Ricardo, still a boy, would scrape the sweet rice pudding pot, smudging his nose with cinnamon. How could that boy, who cried whenever I left his line of sight, become the man who left me in this warehouse for spent lives and never looked back? The hospital food was bland, a colorless, memoryless paste that I swallowed with difficulty, not for the lack of flavor, but because each spoonful was a confirmation of my abandonment. I had become invisible. The nurses passed by me with a cold efficiency, changing my IV, taking my blood pressure, but without ever truly seeing me. They didn't see Elvira, the seamstress who could turn a simple piece of cloth into a dream. They only saw bed 12, an old body occupying a space that would soon belong to someone else. And, in the loneliness of the afternoons, I would find myself staring at my own hands, the joints swollen with arthritis, the fingers crooked, and wonder if their usefulness had truly come to an end. They, which had always been my source of pride and sustenance, now trembled holding a glass of water, silent witnesses to my new and crushing uselessness. The girl in the next bed, Sophia, rarely spoke. Her youth contrasted with the resignation in her eyes, a well of sorrow I knew well. She would spend hours staring at the ceiling, lost in a world that seemed to have stolen everything from her. That night, the cold seeping through the window cracks was sharper, and I saw her shrink under the thin blanket, hugging her own body in a futile attempt to stay warm. Her sweater, made of a worn-out pilled wool, had an ugly tear at the shoulder, an open mouth that seemed to scream her vulnerability. It was then that, in a voice that was little more than a whisper, she turned to me. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her eyes fixed on the cloth bag at the foot of my bed. "What's in there?" My heart leaped. I opened the bag and showed her my treasure. Colorful spools of thread, a set of shining needles, a small pair of scissors, and my metal thimble, smoothed by decades of use. A glimmer of hope appeared in her eyes. Could you fix my sweater? It's the only thing I have from my mother." The request was so simple, so pure, that it broke through the crust of apathy that had formed around my heart. The moment I took the garment in my hands, a head nurse, a woman with broad shoulders and a sour expression, stopped beside our beds. "What is this?" she asked, her voice loud and harsh, drawing the attention of other patients. "Do you think you're at home, Grandma? This is a hospital, not a sewing workshop. Put that nonsense away right now. We don't have time for this." The word nonsense echoed in the room, a public sentence declaring my entire life, my art, as something trivial and worthless. Blood rushed to my face, a heat of shame I hadn't felt since childhood. I was frozen, with Sophia's sweater in my lap and the eyes of strangers upon me. The nurse shot me one last glare before continuing on her way, the sound of her shoes in the hallway like hammer blows on my dignity. Sophia lowered her head, the glimmer of hope in her eyes completely extinguished, and I saw in her the reflection of my own defeat. In that instant, I had a choice. I could obey, put away my sewing kit, and accept the verdict that I was just a useless burden. I could sink into that bed and let the sadness finally consume me. Or I could fight, not with shouts or arguments, but in the only way I knew how, with a needle and a thread. I waited until the ward was silent again, until the darkness of night offered us a cloak of complicity. Then, under the dim light of the small bedside lamp, I turned so my body blocked the view from the hallway, and, with hands trembling not from arthritis, but from determination, I threaded the needle. The first stitch I made in that worn fabric was an act of silent rebellion. I wasn't just mending a tear. I was declaring that my skill was not nonsense. I kept sewing, feeling the thread join not only the wool, but also our solitudes. It was then, as I passed the needle through the lining to hide the knot, that my fingers touched something that shouldn't have been there. A small hardness, a secret stitched into the heart of that worn-out piece of clothing. As my fingers explored the outline of the secret object, my mind traveled to a time when these same hands were the source of all security in my son's world. I was widowed when Ricardo was only 8, and the hum of my sewing machine became the soundtrack of his childhood. The small house in Iztapalapa, which I inherited from my parents, was modest, but I filled it with the smell of new fabrics and the warmth of the ironing press. I was the first to wake and the last to sleep, sewing. For the downtown shops, mending the neighbors' clothes, making quinceañera dresses that turned girls into princesses for a night. Every peso earned was sacred, destined for Ricardo's books, his impeccably pressed uniform, the roasted chicken on Sundays that was our little luxury. I remember one night when he fell ill with a high fever, and I spent the dawn at his side, a damp cloth on his forehead with one hand, and the other sewing an urgent order under the light of a lamp. I didn't see it as a sacrifice. It was simply the language of my love. He was my world, the masterpiece I was weaving with the threads of my own life. I taught him to be strong, to be honest, to value hard work. Little did I know that the most important lessons, those of loyalty and gratitude, had been lost somewhere along the way, unraveling like a poorly made seam that gives way under the slightest pressure. Seeing him graduate from the university, the first in our family, was the proudest day of my life. I wore my best dress, one I had made myself, and cried silently in the back row, feeling that every sleepless night, every finger pricked by the needle, had been worth it. The change began subtly, like a loose thread that slowly unravels an entire weave. The change's name was Isabella. She entered our lives with a polished smile and expensive shoes, from a family that measured people's worth by the neighborhood they lived in and the car they drove. At first, I tried hard to like her, to see what my son saw. I prepared his favorite dishes, offered to alter her designer dresses, but my gestures of affection were met with a veiled condescension. My food was too greasy, my stories were quaint, My neighborhood accent was something to be corrected in a low voice. Ricardo, blinded by love, began to see the world, and me, through her eyes. The first public humiliation happened during a dinner to meet Isabella's parents, in an expensive restaurant where there were more pieces of cutlery than dishes. In my home. Trying to connect, I began to proudly tell them about a complex embroidery job I had done for a local church altar. In the middle of my sentence, Isabella interrupted me with a light but cutting laugh. "Oh, Mama, let's not bore everyone with your sewing stories," she said, placing her hand on mine. "How about you tell us about your new curtains, darling?" She turned to Ricardo, changing the subject and leaving me with the words caught in my throat. I looked at my son, hoping for a look of defense, a small gesture of support, but he just smiled at his fiancée, complicit in my erasure. In that moment, at that table full of strangers, I felt like an old, embarrassing ornament, a piece that no longer matched the new decor of his life. The second humiliation was deeper, as it happened in the sanctuary I once called home. After they got married, they convinced me to sell my little house. "It's to help with the down payment on our new apartment, Mom. You'll have a beautiful room. You'll live with us. You won't have to worry about anything anymore," Ricardo assured me. The truth was that my room was a small maid's quarter at the back, and my sewing machine was put in storage, covered with a sheet, because its noise disturbed Isabella's home office. I tried to help, but my attempts were seen as meddling. One night I couldn't sleep and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. Their bedroom door was ajar, and I heard their voices in tense whispers. "I don't know what to do, Ricardo. The bills are getting higher and higher," Isabella said. "With your mother here, it's another mouth to feed. Her pension barely covers her medicines. She's becoming a financial weight, a burden we have to carry." I stood frozen, the glass trembling in my hand. My son's response was the final stab. He didn't defend me. He sighed, tiredly. "I know, Isa. What do you want me to do? She's my mother." The resignation in his voice was worse than any accusation. I was no longer his mother. I was a problem to be solved, a burden, an extra mouth. I returned to my room without a sound, lay in bed, and hugged my own body, feeling the chill of abandonment settle into my bones, long before they left me in this hospital. That knowledge made my last months in their house a silent hell. Every plate of food I accepted felt like a forced act of charity. Every square meter I occupied was space stolen from their perfect life. When I developed a persistent cough, I saw the glint of an opportunity in Isabella's eyes. They surrounded me with false concern, insisting I needed specialized care that they, with their busy lives, couldn't provide. The trip to the hospital was a blur of empty promises and rushed gestures. "We'll be back every day, Mom. It's for your own good." The car door closed, and with it, the final chapter of my life with them. Now, back in the present, in the dim light of the hospital bed, the memory of those humiliations fueled the small flame of rebellion the nurse had tried to extinguish. I looked at Sophia, whose face was pale with anticipation. "There's something in here," I whispered, showing her the small lump I felt through the lining. Her eyes widened, and she nodded, giving me permission to uncover her mother's secret. With the care of someone performing a delicate surgery, I used the tip of my small scissors to undo the internal seam, one thread at a time. What fell into my palm was not a button or a stone a child might save. It was a small piece of paper folded so many times upon itself that it had become a hard, yellowed square. With trembling fingers, I unfolded it. It was a lottery ticket, and on it, nearly faded, was a date from almost 5 years ago. Okay. Act 4, Emotional Climax. I held the small, yellowed paper in my hands, and its fragility seemed to mirror our own. Here was a forgotten dream of Sophia's mother, a ticket bought with the hope of a different life, then stored away and stitched inside the only valuable piece of clothing she could leave for her daughter, perhaps by instinct, perhaps by accident. Sophia told me, her voice choked, that her mother always bought a ticket with the same numbers. Her own birthday, her grandmother's, and the day they first met. It was a small ritual of faith in a world that gave them few reasons to believe. Looking at the nearly illegible numbers, a wave of skepticism hit me. So many years had passed. Lottery prizes expire. Unclaimed fortunes are lost in the labyrinths of bureaucracy. Were we, two abandoned women in a public hospital, just clinging to another false hope? The initial joy gave way to a palpable anxiety. What would we do with it? We had no way to check. We were trapped in these beds, dependent on the goodwill of overworked nurses who already saw me as a nuisance. Sophia seemed to read my thoughts, and her face, which had lit up for a moment, closed back into its usual mask of resignation. I handed the ticket to her. "It's yours," I said. "It's your mother's inheritance." She held it with a reverent delicacy, not as a winning ticket, but as the last love letter she would ever receive. And in that silence, the possibility, however remote, was a thread of light in the darkness. It was proof that even in the most forgotten places, fate might have stitched a secret plan, just waiting for the right hands to discover it. Our salvation came in the form of Javier, a young janitor with slumped shoulders and a kind gaze who always gave us a sincere good morning, a rarity in that place. He saw us whispering about the ticket, the excitement and fear dancing on our faces, and he approached with his cleaning cart. With a shyness that contradicted his curiosity, he asked what was going on. We showed him the old paper. Instead of laughing at us, his eyes widened. He vaguely remembered a news story, years ago, about a multi-million-peso prize that had never been claimed in Mexico City, a field day for the newspapers for weeks. "Wait, here?" he said, and disappeared down the hall. The hours that followed were the longest of my life. Every time the door opened, our hearts leaped. Finally, when we had all but lost hope, Javier returned, not in his work uniform, but in his regular clothes, his shift having ended. He didn't have to say a word. The look on his face, a mixture of shock and euphoria, said it all. In his hands, he held a printout from a news website. He sat on the edge of Sophia's bed and in a trembling voice began to read the numbers drawn on that forgotten date. 6, 17, 23. Each number he pronounced was a step we climbed out of the pit. When he read the last number, the air seemed to thin. All 6 numbers matched. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by a sob that escaped from Sophia. It wasn't a cry of joy, but a sound of relief so profound, so laden with past pain, that it broke my heart. The fortune wasn't just money, it was justice. In that moment, as Sophia cried, silently, holding my hand with a strength I didn't know she possessed, something realigned within me. The money was hers, the destiny was hers, but the discovery had been mine. My hands, the same ones Ricardo and Isabella considered useless, the same ones the head nurse had scorned as tools for nonsense, had found hope in the lining of a torn sweater. A wave of quiet dignity filled me. I was not a victim waiting for my son to return. I was Elvira, the seamstress, and my hands could still join. The broken threads of the world. It was at that exact moment of clarity that the room door opened. It was Ricardo. My heart sank, not with longing, but with a cold revulsion. He wasn't carrying flowers, nor an apology. He was carrying a clipboard. He walked to my bed with the haste of someone handling a bureaucratic task, barely glancing at Sophia. "Mom, good thing you're awake," he said, with that falsely affectionate tone he used to get what he wanted. "I just need your signature here. It's to authorize the sale of the last of the old furniture that was in storage. That way you don't have to worry about it anymore." He held out a pen. I looked at his hand, then at mine, and for the first time, I saw the truth with painful clarity. He was there to finalize my annulment, to erase the last traces of my existence. With a calm that surprised him, I raised my hand. "No," I said. My voice didn't waver. "My hands," I continued, looking at my crooked fingers. "The hands you and your wife consider a burden, have just stitched a future, but not yours." The confusion on Ricardo's face was almost comical. He blinked, uncomprehending, looking from the clipboard to me as if I were delirious. "Mom? What are you talking about? It's just a signature. Stop being stubborn." His irritation began to show, the thin veneer of false concern peeling away to reveal the selfishness beneath. But I no longer felt the need to please him, to seek his approval. The blind loyalty that had chained me to him my whole life had been broken. I pulled my hand back and placed it over Sophia's, who was clutching the winning ticket. "I said I'm not signing," I repeated, and this time my voice had the weight of steel. "There is nothing of yours left for me to sign, Ricardo. You've already taken everything you could. You can go now." He opened his mouth to protest, perhaps to shout, but upon seeing the expression on my face, not of anger, but of a distant compassion, as if I were looking at a pitiful stranger, he fell silent. He was a spoiled child who had been denied a sweet. With no more arguments, he backed away, defeated by a force he could not comprehend. He left the room, slamming the door. The sound echoed, not like thunder, but like the soft closing of a book. Sophia looked at me, her eyes shining with admiration and tears. "You," she whispered, "you didn't just fix my sweater. You made me feel like I matter." And I knew she was right. Ricardo thought he was leaving me to die. Our problem solved. He didn't know that the signature I refused him was the seal of my freedom. That night, we didn't sleep. We planned the first day of the rest of our lives. The next morning, what I did would leave everyone, especially the staff of that hospital, speechless. We would like to feel your presence at this very moment. Please write in the comments which city you are watching us from and what time it is there now. By doing this, we create a network of energy and support for this story, a reminder that we are not alone in our battles. Each comment is a point of light in our healing process. The next morning, a determined quiet settled over our corner of the hospital. With Javier's help, we contacted a social services agency that sent a representative to ensure my rights were upheld. The head nurse looked at me in disbelief when I formally announced I was discharging myself of my own volition. There was no drama, no accusations, just the dignity of a woman taking back control of her destiny. While Sophia, now with an upright posture and a gleam of confidence in her eyes, signed her own papers, I packed my few belongings into my cloth bag. That small bag, which once represented all I had left of a life of servitude, was now the luggage for a new journey. We walked out through the same doors I had entered as a burden. We left behind the smell of disinfectant and the sound of suffering, walking side by side toward the morning sun, not as victims who had won the lottery, but as partners who had found in each other the strength to rewrite their own stories. Freedom wasn't in the fortune that awaited us, but in the simple act of taking that first step outside, together. We didn't buy a mansion or designer clothes. The first thing we did was find a modest house, but one with a sunny yard and a room big enough for our dream. That space, once empty and lifeless, quickly filled with the hum of secondhand sewing machines, the smell of fresh coffee, and the vibrant colors of dozens of fabric rolls. On the door, we painted a wooden sign with careful lettering, El hilo que une, the thread that binds. The studio was born not as a business, but as a refuge. Sophia, with a knack for numbers and organization that surprised me, took care of everything, while I did what I was born to do, teach. Other women began to arrive, drawn by the promise of learning a trade. They were single mothers, widows, young women who, like Sophia, had no one. I didn't just teach them how to sew. I taught them how to mend their own lives, to find value in their hands, and to weave a support network that no one could tear apart. News about Ricardo and Isabella reached me through an old neighbor who would call me from time to time. My refusal to sign the papers for the sale of my furniture was the small stone that started an avalanche. Apparently, they had been counting on that money to cover debts they had hidden from each other. The luxurious apartment, which was the symbol of their status, became a financial prison. The facade of perfect happiness they showed the world began to crack, revealing the rot of greed and selfishness. My neighbor told me they fought constantly, their voices echoing down the building's hallway. Their empire of appearances, built on my sacrifice and my annulment, was fragile and hollow. I felt no joy hearing this, only a distant pity. Justice, I realized, doesn't need revenge. Sometimes, it just requires you to step away so the rotten structure can collapse on its own. Today, the late afternoon light streams through the studio window, illuminating the concentrated faces of my students. The sound of the sewing machines is the music of our resurrection. I see Sophia across the room, laughing with a client, and my heart fills with a peace that no material wealth could ever buy. She calls me Mom, and the word, which once brought me so much pain, is now my greatest honor. I look at my hands, still gnarled and marked by time, but now they are not a sign of my age or fragility. They are a map of every life we've touched, of every piece of hope we've stitched. We built a family, not of blood, but of thread, basted with mutual respect and the silent strength of women who refuse to be discarded. Today, I don't have the luxury my son so desperately sought, but I have respect, and that no one can take from me anymore.